This is a call to rescind the Calgary Climate Emergency Declaration and Plan. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. Some new information has become available that makes it clear that we should not proceed with the Calgary Emergency Declaration and Calgary Climate Plan. I'd like to walk you through the material that we found, and then you can decide for yourself. So let's get at it. City of Calgary, for your information, our house is not on fire. On November 16, 2021, Calgary City Council votes to declare a climate emergency. In 2023, it's time for a review. The rationale at the time for declaring the emergency was that the cost of doing nothing is very high, and that the city wanted to lead by example, and that it also sets us up for a meaningful statement about climate resilience, and a declaration of climate emergency is critical to our city, to our province, to our country, and to the world at this point in time. Let's see if that's true. On November the 8th, 2022, the Parliamentary Budget Officer issued a report on global greenhouse gas emissions and Canadian GDP. In it, the Parliamentary Budget Officer debunks climate alarmism. In November 2022, Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer released a report on the effect of greenhouse gas emissions on Canadian GDP growth over the next 80 years. Ross McKittrick writes that the report's overall conclusions agree with mainstream economic thinking on the link, or lack of it, between global warming and economic growth. McKittrick is an economist and a climate policy, climate model analyst. The PBO looked at two different scenarios. One was emissions reduction policies which stall out at today's level and nobody complies with their Paris Agreement commitments. And the second was that countries all comply with their Paris commitments in full and on time. And the PBO was advised by Environment and Climate Change Canada to assume that Canada will warm 2.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. Dr. McKittrick considers that an overestimate. So what if every country stalls out? The economic impact on climate change is small. Under Scenario 1, Canada's GDP in 2100 would be 6.6% smaller than otherwise due to negative impacts of global warming. Assuming a modest 2% growth per year in Canada's economy, Dr. McKittrick calculates that the GDP would grow by 388% over the next 80 years. But according to the PBO, if we do nothing, it will grow by only 381%, which is a small difference compared to the other drivers of the economy. In fact, the IPCC's fifth assessment report also concluded that the economic impact of climate change is small compared to other drivers. And the Parliamentary Bureau Budgetary Officer also found that the cost of inaction is tiny while the cost of compliance is huge. In Scenario 2, with everyone meeting their Paris targets, the above 6.6% difference becomes 5.8%, a minuscule difference of 0.8 percentage points. Incurring the enormous costs of complying with the Paris Agreement will mean that Canada's economy will grow not by the assumed 2.0% per year average, but by 1.986% per year. Yet the compliance costs will take an order of magnitude more off our growth rate. Dr. McKittrick notes that one of the justifications cited for climate action is the cost of inaction, i.e., something that is too large. But here, according to the PBO, the cost of inaction is tiny. And the PBO goes on to say, while the impact on Canadian GDP is from global GHG emissions, Canada's own emissions are not large enough to materially impact climate change. So, if Canada's emissions do not materially impact climate change, Calgary's emissions certainly do not. So we're squandering our future. We're burdening our children with needless climate action debt. Our president of Friends of Science Society has written 2 pieces on this topic, and here are some points he makes. Continued emissions growth with no climate action might mean a $140 billion reduction in GDP 80 years from now. But the city of Calgary plans to spend $87 billion on climate action, or 62% of that. And the city of Ottawa plans to spend $57.4 billion on climate action. Combined, they will spend more than this estimated GDP loss for no climate or economic benefit. Our children will be burdened with debt while green cronies get rich. We will spend trillions to not save billions. Calgary and Ottawa will spend the alleged climate GDP. So, even the IPCC has acknowledged that future climate change will have negligible impact on GDP growth, and the PBO also looked at what Canada's GDP would look like with full Paris Accord compliance, as I mentioned earlier. Well, with full Paris Accord compliance, Canada's GDP would still be 5.8% below the new do-nothing case. So for the trillions of dollars Canada will spend fighting climate change, will improve our GDP prospects by roughly $17 billion, or 0.8%. And note, these numbers are a bit different than those in the Financial Post story, but they're very similar in proportion. And here's a graph that gives you a bit of an indication of what we're talking about here. So you can see that there's hardly any benefit to either meeting all of the targets or not complying at all. So I'll be posting this on our blog so that you can have a look at the detail. And of course, other commentators prior to this have also made similar commentaries. Bjorn Lomborg did a peer-reviewed study, and he showed that if everyone met their Paris Agreement targets, the impact would be a reduction in warming of 0.05 degrees Celsius, which is immeasurable. And even if they met all their promises for the next 70 years, if every nation fulfills their promise by 2030 and continues to fulfill them, then, ta-da! The entirety of Paris promises reduced temperature rises by just 0.17 degrees Celsius by 2100. And yet we'd be spending $1 to $2 trillion per year for virtually no benefit. Now, Calgary's cost of inaction analysis is deeply flawed. And I just wanted to mention that we went back and looked at the original documentation here to see how the city of Calgary had arrived at its conclusion that there must be a climate emergency and that we must take this dramatic multi-billion-dollar action. And we found that there's a very significant flaw in the analysis, and I'm just going to walk you through that. So this group called All One Sky worked with someone from the city of Calgary. So it was issued by All One Sky, but there was a city of Calgary individual working on it as well. And All One Sky's analysis uses the implausible scenario as a basis. So RCP 8.5 scenario is described here as the most conservative of global no policy scenarios, but in fact it is an implausible scenario. And here you can see the scenarios that we're talking about. They're called RCP. This stands for Representative Concentration Pathway. And these are computer-generated, computer-simulated scenarios that model representations of what happens if we put a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This RCP 8.5 uses factors of coal and oil use that are implausible. They would be impossible to even achieve, and very similar for RCP 6. Now, the RCP is related to carbon dioxide and its warming effect on the climate. And it's also important to note that this implausible scenario contains many billions more people than these other scenarios, which might exacerbate people's concerns of overpopulation, and that could lead to very negative policies such as euthanasia. So here is a very colorful graphic from the All One Sky report, and you can see this really hot thermometer and the tangible plus intangible costs here that they came up with. But you can see that the PBO was advised by Environment and Climate Change Canada to assume Canada will warm 2.5 degrees Celsius by 2100, which Dr. McKittrick considered an overestimate. So you can see that this is way, way below what these estimates are coming up with. And again, the RCP 8.5 is an implausible scenario. It's definitely not conservative, and it is not business as usual. And just to put these temperatures in context, most Calgarians are well aware that we frequently have Chinook winds, and Chinook winds gain 5.5 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 feet of descent. They can gust in excess of hurricane force, and radical temperature changes as much as 30 degrees Celsius can occur in just a few hours. So really, if we're talking about 1.5, 2 degrees Celsius, these kinds of numbers, for Calgarians, this is ridiculous, ludicrous. And Dr. Roger Pielke Jr. has done a very good presentation for the National Association of Scholars, wherein he discusses these implausible scenarios. He also discusses extreme weather events, because that's the other thing people often say. And actually, I just did a paper of my own that's posted on Social Science Research Net that responds to Dr. Timothy Haney of Mount Royal University regarding extreme weather events and Calgary's climate future. And these reports by Roger Pielke Jr. show, first of all, that RCP 8.5 is an implausible scenario, and this is where the whole thought of a climate emergency has come from, the misuse of this scenario. The other thing is his book and many of his writings. He's been a consultant with the insurance agencies for many, many years. He's been tracking disaster reporting and costs for 25 years or more. And he is also a past IPCC contributor. His reports have been cited by the IPCC, so he's a very qualified commentator. So I think if people have a look at this book, Disasters and Climate Change, you'll find that the main reason why insurance costs have risen is because we're doing things like building a modern city on a floodplain and then wondering why. So certainly putting up wind turbines and solar panels will not stop extreme weather events, which are integral to climate change. One thing that people should really be aware of is that emerging nations will demand more and more energy, and Alberta can supply it, and Calgary is the energy capital of Canada. So let's have a look at this graph here. This is from a report by Robert Lyman, and he notes that many people, especially in Europe and North America, may not be aware that their combined populations are only 15% of the world's total, that the total population of Africa exceeds that combined total, and that the population of Asia is 4 times that large. So what's happening is that there are several emerging nations. So this report documents which ones, but in countries like China, India, Brazil, many of the African nations, these are emerging nations. They are growing their population. They're moving up the ladder in terms of their socioeconomic comforts and scale of living. And there's a huge demand for oil and gas and coal worldwide. None of these countries are going to stop. So when you go back and look at this population pie chart, you can see that the West is simply committing economic suicide, and these countries will far outstrip us in terms of industrial development because we're actually, hamstringing and really handcuffing our industry, not only our oil and gas industry, but any industry, because the only way that you can flourish is with affordable energy. And we have lots of it. We should be using it to our benefit and not using it against ourselves by blocking it. So let's have a look at some other things here. You can read that on our website. The other thing to remember is that climate change is cyclical, and here we're looking at 2,000 years of climate change, and you can see that 2,000 years ago it was kind of chilly, then it warmed up, then it got cold again, it warmed up again, got cold again, then it got really, really warm 1,000 years ago. That would be the medieval warm period. Then it got cold and quite cold, and then very, very cold in the Little Ice Age, and then it warmed up again and into the present. So, you don't see that there's really a crisis here. Climate change is a cyclical thing. It's mostly natural. It's not you, and it's not carbon dioxide. So again, let's reiterate what the Parliamentary Budget Officer found, that if Canada's emissions do not materially impact climate change, Calgary's emissions certainly won't. And this is what he said in the report: while the impact on Canadian GDP is from global GHG emissions, Canada's own emissions are not large enough to materially impact climate change. So I hope people will read our latest report from Robert Lyman, Canada's 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan, Part 1, Killing the Canadian Golden Goose. And you can see that all the carbon taxes, climate policies, layered one on top of the other. There's over 600 of them. They've now been sort of compacted into about 200. But they're crushing Canadian taxpayers, and Canadian taxpayers are the golden geese of Canada. We have a number of reports related to the City of Calgary, a very early one from 2013 where we told them that renewable is not so doable. We have these from 2017 where we looked at the Calgary Climate Plan at the time, and we did a cost-benefit analysis, and we also looked at the cost of doing something wrong. And we pointed out that these taxes that are piling on to pay for these projects that don't benefit climate or the economy are turning us into kind of a state of Rome. By the 5th century, men were ready to abandon civilization itself in order to escape the fearful load of taxes. And then we recently issued the Calgary Climate Emergency Declaration, and we called it expensive virtue signaling, not based on evidence. So let's rescind the pathways to poverty, which is the Calgary Emergency Declaration and Plan, and let's go back and feel the energy. Calgary is a fabulous city. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. We have many, many complex challenges, though. We have a lot of problems with homeless people, with fentanyl addiction. We have many problems with our gutted downtown core, which was really done by the tar sands campaign. Many of those environmental groups are funded by the federal, provincial, and municipal governments. So taxpayers' money has funded these people to run the tar sands campaign against Canadians, against our best interests, and with much of the climate hysteria, which we now have seen is irrelevant. So I hope that you will take it upon yourself to speak with your relevant colleagues, friends, and make your voices heard at City Hall regarding this new information. We must rescind the Calgary Emergency Declaration and the city's climate plan. So have a look at the reports that I cited here. I'll put this all up on the blog so that you can go to the links. Thanks very much for listening. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling. By the way, we've been in operation now for 20 years. We offer this information free of charge. We've had a number of people reach out to us, ask how they can support us. Of course, you can join us as a member. You can donate. Many people have just been sending us an e-transfer of $20 just for our 20th year. Of course, we'd love to have more money, but 20 is good. And if you can't send anything, you can always just share our material and speak up. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling. Thank you.